School makes you dumb. You're watching Making Sense with Robbie. Let's get started. I was a good student through grade school and high school. I was studied really hard. I spent lots of time doing my homework, and I was like a good student. I got good grades. I was very dedicated to my studies. But it wasn't until university where I sort of realized that I could think and that I could pursue interests of my own. I could follow the stuff that was actually interesting to me. What happened at university is that I maybe didn't do as well as my housemates, but I did learn a lot of stuff that they didn't learn. And I was always curious about books. I was curious about new ideas. I was just kind of like curious about like exploring and understanding and sort of learning about who I was. As I was going through high school, I did learn a lot, and I did learn things that were useful and important, at least as far as it was necessary to get into university and kind of move on to the next step. But if I think about it, like I was really interested in like shows like Bill Nye the Science Guy and other TV shows about science. And so I was learning and curious about science, or about thinking about science in a way that was different to what I was learning at school. And there's lots of like formalized learning that you do at school, but like there's not that necessarily that general sort of interest-driven learning that you would do outside of school. When I went to university, I did my work and I passed all my classes. But I was really curious about like learning things. I was curious about reading books and books that weren't related to school. But when I went to university, and I kind of made sure that I chose a program where I had lots of options to have electives. And so I took a lot of random electives. Like I took as many electives as I could, and they were all unrelated to my major. And so I had lots learning. I had like a very broad, generalized education. That distinguished me from my housemates and the people who I was going to school with, because they had very focused learning. They studied only what they were supposed to study, and they chose electives within that same sort of range of things. Kind of look back at things, like I think that all of my housemates, they ended up doing work in sciences, and I kind of do work now in IT. And you could say that, well, like maybe I didn't learn as much as they did because I didn't study the same subjects as they did. I didn't stick to science. I didn't stick to my major. But I would also say that I kind of learned a lot of things and had a lot of experiences as a result of school or after school that they wouldn't have had. But generally speaking, when you're going to school, it's about sort of reading the textbooks, taking notes, keeping track of what the teacher says, and then afterwards asks questions about that. So a lot of what happens in school is that kids learn, or we get educated, we get told sort of what to think about things, and then we are asked by the teacher questions or a test, and then we just recite what we learned. We just repeat what we've learned, and then we get rewarded. We get rewarded for just reciting or saying what we have been taught or what we've been told is the answer. Like it's good to understand things and be able to reply and respond to them, but it also isn't necessarily understanding how to think. It's not necessarily teaching you how to think. It's more teaching you memorization and reciting answers and giving the right answer, and opposed to giving your own unique answer. It doesn't mean that you know something or that you understand or that you can think about it. It just means that you are able to answer the questions that you're asked about it. And it's great to like memorize things and to know lots of things, but do you know how to manipulate those ideas? Do you know how to think about those ideas? Do you know how to think uniquely or novelly about those ideas? Probably not. And that's not something you necessarily learn at school, because that's not the objective of school. But if you kind of step back and think about like what school is all about, like why does school exist? And you could say there's like these noble reasons why school exists: to educate people, free them from whatever, to make their lives better. And all those things are somewhat true, but like the real purpose of school is to create people who can be good employees, who can be like sort of average employees who fit in, who are able to do their jobs and not break the rules. Like that is essentially what school is training us for. In other words, school sort of trains us to be obedient order followers. In addition to this, school trains us or teaches us or prepares us to be employees in the future. People who have a job, who follow instructions, who follow orders, who do what they're supposed to do when they're told, and who don't necessarily ask lots of questions, who don't disrupt or doubt the status quo, and who go along with the flow. A really good example of this is law school or medical school. And these two jobs require that people are really good at sort of conforming and obeying the rules and following the rules and understanding the rules. And to be a good lawyer, right? Like the better you know the law, the more sort of obedient you are to the rules, then you can find those sort of steps or those places where you could sort of step around the law or where the law is inconsistent. Yes, it's important to be a critical thinker and someone who can problem solve, but it's also about following the rules. It's also about sticking within the lines and sort of doing things the right way, like the defined way, in the way that it's supposed to be done. done. And I would say at the same time, we always hear about these examples of like these billionaires who start these companies, and they always talk about how like they dropped out of school. The reality though is that that's a small minority of people who drop out of school. Like the majority of people who drop out of school probably are outside of the middle. They don't have the same opportunities average people would have. And this is kind of interesting because it shows that like if you want the normal outcome, if you want to have like sort of the typical outcome, you want to have the sort of average outcome, then like school makes the most sense, right? Because it prepares you to be an average person. It prepares you to be normal. Whereas like people who step out of that, like either they have great success or they have, failure. And failure is all relative, but like it's a lot harder if you haven't graduated high school to like get a, decent job. But if you graduate from high school and you go to university, then you can have more opportunities to get jobs. My point here, my intention here is that like school teaches you to be average and it teaches you how to have an average outcome. And so this is why private schools or alternative education will teach people to think in a different way. And so yes, they like kind of learn the rules and they learn the way to fit into society, but the context of learning at a private school is different, right? Like you get this different sense of how things should go. Like this is partially part of the reason why people who would go to private schools tend to have better outcomes, because they are going to these schools that are preparing them to be above average. Like that is sort of what happens at a private school. You learn how to be above average. Whereas if you go to regular school, you learn how to be average. And if you don't go to school, then you learn to be below average. In essence, the purpose of school is to create rule-following workers. It's not to create like free-thinking individuals who can think for themselves, who can come up with novel ideas. Because while those values are valuable, they're not necessary for everyone. In fact, probably society wouldn't work as well if everyone was a free-thinking individual. Society needs a lot of normal average people because that's how most of society functions. The goal of as education in school isn't to make us creative people. It's about making us like dumb, making us normal, making us average. There's nothing wrong with being normal and average. The outcomes don't necessarily relate to success. They don't necessarily relate to the jobs that we're having, but they do relate to sort of how our personality is, or like how we are as an individual who is thinking in the world and making sense of things. And so my question to you is, do you learn on your own? Like, are you a self-motivated learner? Let me know in the comments below. If you found this informative or educational, click that like button because I'd really appreciate it. If you are curious about learning how to think about things, but you don't want to be told what to think about them, click that subscribe button because that's what I'm here for. You've been watching Making Sense with Robbie. Thanks for watching, and we'll talk next time. Goodbye.